change of track from this lecture onwards. What I have done until now is that we begin with reflectivity, and I looked into a specific kind of reflectivity called reason, and tried to give that there are certain civilizational flavors to reason, and it's not that these flavors have disappeared and reasoning has become fairly uniform now. It's not the case, and I gave one idea last time which we are going to work on now onwards, and that was the idea of something born in 17th century Europe, which is known as Renaissance. Many things happened in Renaissance. New art came, new politics came, new sort of social organizations came, and it's affecting rest of the world. But there was idea of a continuum of space-time which was new in the world, in the sense that none of the other traditions like medieval Europe or China or India or Greece or Arabia had a clue about the continuum. Continuum was something new. It's like space and time on which the rest of the world is playing itself. And this continuum was mathematical in the sense that it was spatio-numeric kind of continuum. I am going to develop on that. So there was a epochal movement of working out this idea of continuum, and it's found in every domain of human affairs. What I am going to do is to look at 17th century Europe and analyze this phenomena a little bit more, but the way I will do is, maybe before that, here is a description. I am going to change track and look at the opposition between science and humanities, which has come to stay today. Today we have idea, most of you also have, and it's in the air that there is something different between science and humanities, maybe in terms of method or otherwise, maybe in terms of subject matter they deal with, and this opposition is related to what can be called as a respectable sphere of knowledge. Humanities is not probably that respectable as science is today. We will look into this opposition, but the period we are talking about, Renaissance, where the new science is born and new politics is born, new art is born. This is Renaissance period, which is there isn't much opposition in science and humanities. It develops in the late 19th century and 20th century, this opposition, and it's there hardwired into our university systems and curriculums and research, etc. For example, in Renaissance, some of these people we know, Descartes, Newton, Leibniz, etc. These people spend lot of their time working on humanities, and next 3 lectures are going to be about the humanities which was engaged in and researched on by Newton, by Descartes, and by Leibniz. There is another period in Europe called Enlightenment, which follows its late 18th century, 19th century is known as a period of enlightenment, where whatever was achieved in thought in Renaissance period was consolidated into what we know as, say, modern science, modern theory of polity, modern theory of idea of a modern is born in Enlightenment. Enlightenment is late 18th century, 19th century. If you look at modernity, we will go back to around that period, and Why we are doing this? Because we will look into confluence of science and humanities in future, in the end, towards the end of the course. What are the grounds for it? So we will look into why there is a difference between science and humanities, what exactly is this difference, and how in future, what is the fate of this difference. So here is a statement from one of the thinkers of Enlightenment, Immanuel Kant. It sort of it's a very well quoted, off quoted statement which I have done here. It sort of speaks of really what enlightenment is, the spirit of enlightenment. And here is a quote: enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. A man had lived immature life, according to Kant, and to understand what this immaturity is and what is the light which one sees in European Enlightenment. Immaturity is the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. What constitutes immaturity according to him is that one doesn't have confidence in one's own understanding, irrespective of others. One is dependent on others for understanding. That is one big move, according to Kant, which is made in Europe. This immaturity is self-imposed when its cause lies not in lack of understanding, but in lack of resolve and courage to use it without guidance from another. There is some kind of epistemic or courage in knowledge he is talking about, and in Latin it's called sapere audi, dare to be wise. This was a slogan which became very famous after Kant, that something which happened in Enlightenment was that people dared to be knowledgeable and wise. This kind of courage is something which humanity didn't have earlier, and there was some kind of this is just characterization by Kant of rest of the world as well as previous Europe in medieval times and earlier times, that there wasn't this courage to put all your cards on knowledge. There were other affairs, human affairs, etc., human relations, other things where people lived their life. But to put all stakes onto the domain of knowledge is something which is happening in Enlightenment. This was a kind of a way of characterizing this period, and we have seen this effect. People thought this period won't last much, but its effect is even visible today, and almost all societies and polities in the world have come to mold it themselves in accordance with it. And this phenomena is global and very powerful. It began with the rise of colonization. The confidence European man had in terms of telling others what to think, how to rule, how to behave, what to dress, etc. It's a European man could tell this to the world, and this courage has come out of this. And we have this fiat of colonization which began in the 19th century. It began earlier, but not with that courage. But in the 19th century, it became a great political phenomena. And there is since then been modernization of world and Europeanization of world in some sense. Even the manners are European. Even table manners have become European. So this is, we are talking of this period. This period is preceded by what is Renaissance, and where a lot of new thought came up, radically new thought came up, and it has effect till today. So we will cover three thinkers, that is Descartes, Newton and Leibniz. What did they think about, and what was their idea of man and human affairs. So let's go to Newton. Newton is a very familiar figure because all of you have learned Newtonian mechanics. Even 200 years ago, I mean, children of your age never learned Newton's mechanics in India and also in Europe. It's only in 19th century that this came into curriculum. Now this is a painting of Blake. Blake was a Renaissance painter and trying to imagine Newton as a great geometer and the person who really worked out the design of universe, This kind of sort of portraiture is new in Europe, around the world in art. If you look at history of art, you do get portraits of say Mughal emperors, etc. But a kind of portraiture which goes with the theme is very new. And here is Alexander Pope is a well-known poet, and he wrote this about Newton. Nature and nature's law lay hid in night. God said, let Newton be, and all was light. I mean, it's a powerful statement on what this figure of Newton did to the world. And world was never the same after him. Though many people wished that won't be the case, but over time that's what has happened. This person, Sir Isaac Newton, he had a very colorful life. So he was a finance minister of England in that time. It was at that time called Mint Master. He was also president of Royal Society of Science in his foundation years. What his works are, some of his works are, I mean, you may have heard of it. Only one work of Newton is very well known. It's called Principia Mathematica, where he gives his physics, so-called Newtonian physics. And his other works are not much known. Maybe one more called Optics is a bit, people may have impression that he wrote those things. But he did a lot of writing on theology and humanities. And last 30 years, many of these writings have been sort of translated into modern language and published. What really were his concerns of humanities and theology? For instance, he did work on history, a couple of books on history he wrote. He worked out even ancient civilizations he wrote. And he of course wrote on the kind of the way deformities are there in society, etc. He thought a lot about these deformities and wrote about them, which we call in modern times is one of the engagement which humanities has. He had that. He did work on what can be called science, natural philosophy, around 27 works, which are the experiments he did, etc. And he did alchemy. Alchemy was some kind of the way chemistry is done, how to change qualities of substance by adding or doing some process of substance. How do we change qualities of them? That work he did, and people even say that he died of mercury poison because one of the belief Newton had was that mercury is a universal solvent. Everything can be dissolved into mercury. So one can also take out things from mercury, those things which are dissolved, and he indulged with a lot of mercury even for his optics. He used the curvature of mercury to bend light, etc. So people say he died of mercury poison, but he did a lot of work on alchemy. These are large works at that time, and is precursor to chemistry. Even people contemporary of Newton did chemistry which is different from Newton. Newton did alchemy. Alchemy involved manipulating spirits of matter, and in fact all these terms like oxygen, sulfur, etc. These are spiritual kind of terms. But that apart, he did a lot of work which is related to humanities, and we will look into what did he do in about nature of man, about human affairs, about human past, about future of humanity, about the kind of defilements which exist in society, and what reforms they need. Most of this work was not published in his lifetime. They were published later on, and only some of his friends knew about these works, and they were like a secret society at that time. There are people writing about it now, and because his public life was, the kind of things he wrote were not something which were in popular belief. They were very against popular belief. You will just see that. This was a period. What I am going to show is that since you people are familiar with his physics and some of the major concepts of physics, I am going to show how these concepts of physics and the concepts he had in humanities, in theology, are same. His theology and his physics was conceptually unified. He worked a lot on theology and humanities and did physics, but major concepts are same, and his contribution to the world is all these major concepts. This was a time, for instance, here's a quote from Newton. One can't sort of imagine Newton writing this. Opposition to godliness is atheism in profession and idolatry in practice. Atheism is so senseless and odious to mankind. He wrote in one of his work on what is true religion. We will understand these concepts like idolatry, atheism, and what their equivalent is in physics. He mentioned all of those things. In fact, the concepts he worked on in his theology and humanities are the same ones which revolutionized understanding of motion of matter. There was a time, this was a time when Europe, given the Christian background Europe had, the world universe was seen configured into two books. One was the realm of human affairs, which is a book. There was Bible and some other literature along with it. Another was the universe of nature, where the book is book of nature. That there exist these two books, one in which you look for morals, another in which you look for laws, etc. And both these books over centuries have got mystified, and Newton saw, and even others like Descartes and Leibniz, that they are reforming both these books. They are showing how to read scriptures, and they are showing what really is the content of the book of nature, and they worked on both of them together. And in fact, this is also almost quote from Newton, saying the natural philosophy, which is the name then of science, book of nature, implied restoration of the true religion, that both things go together. Let's look at his, this is one of his major idea. It's just there everywhere in his writings. This is Sensorium D. Sensorium is like is a place which all of us carry, which is modern times we call it mind, or even still modern times. It is also called qualia, the qualitative things which you can witness. Each of us have one sensorium per person. Even dogs, cats and birds have sensorium. Sensorium is where stuff from sense organs is disclosed and played up. Sensorium is a template which each of us have. When we get up in the morning, it's lighted up. When you go to sleep, sort of it's closed till the dreamless sleep. When you dream, there is a light in that sensorium. Sensorium is a kind of not a museum of the world, but it's a kind of it's an imagination of what we call today in modern times as mind, and in which all kind of contents are played. In fact, there is a definition of consciousness, a street definition, which says sensorium, whatever plays in sensorium, is a movie in a theater right next to you. Is something which is happening right next to you, is this play of what we perceive in the world, what we think, what we feel, what we sort of engage with. This is a lighted sensorium in which there is a light, and when you are dead, there is no sensorium in that body. Sensorium doesn't exist, whereas when we are alive, sensorium moves with us. Sensorium is something which figurates on our body, because when you get up and go after the class, your sensorium goes along with your body. It's never left behind. It's a so term Newton used is sensorium, and he talked of what really is a sensorium of God. This is D is a Latin term for God, like theos is a Greek term for God, and dt, for instance, comes from that. So the sensorium of God, he was reflecting on the sensorium of God. What really is sensorium of God? These 20 works on theology and humanities are full of awe and understanding, the concepts required to understand a sensorium of God. And this is, and Newton thought that the continuum is space-time continuum, which is a real space where every point is a number. This continuum is a sensorium of God, and space is a tactile organ of God, by which everything in the universe, God is in touch with everything in the universe. Space is that around, because it's a tactile organ of God, God can, there is nothing in the universe which is not in the embrace of God. The God touches everything, and space is like that. The conceptual space is very different, because traditionally you have discrete space, the space where you live, space where you, all kind of discreteness is there in the space, cultural spaces, spaces of literature, etc. You have very many, but this idea that there is one space is fairly unique, and he thought it's a tactile organ of God. And the other aspect of sensorium D is a visual organ of God, which he thought is time, where God can see through fate of everything. What will happen in time, a God can see through all of it. So this is a visual organ of God. Now this is a very powerful understanding. It sort of goes against most ideas of space-time in that period. Continuum is mathematically worked out by Descartes, etc., coordinate geometry and things like that. But to bring continuum into understanding human affairs, and especially the idea of God, is very unique to Newton. Is very unique, and this gave him a real charge, in the sense energy, to look into the book of nature and the book of scriptures afresh, completely. And this was fairly revolutionary. So the tactile organ, which is empty space, is a stage that holds all in God's embrace, such that God can move everything from within. God can move everything. There is nothing in the universe which is outside it. This is a very new thought heard in history of theology. And then the tranquil time flows on eternally in the same calm and equal tenor, bestowing sensible opportunity to God to move things from within, to make people move in directions which are sort of upright, to make not just people, the creatures, but also created thing like matter, corpuscular matter, to move in a direction which is upright. And so once you have such a great, it's a grand imagination. This grand imagination is something which really, if somebody really has it, it will fuel all kind of implications it will have, all kind of entailments it will have, and that's what happened with Newton. He made a strong distinction in line with the Christian doctrine of fall of man. The fall of man is that Adam and Eve, who were created by God, they ate the fruit of knowledge or the apple of knowledge, and since then they are suffering. This is imagination of why man suffers, explanation of why man suffers, because you indulge in knowledge, and this he transformed this as to understand rationality behind it, as a distinction between the sensorium of God and the sensorium of creatures. Creatures are like men, animals, etc. And created things are like matter, like corpuscular matter, which are created. Creatures are people or entities who indulge in creation, further creation, recreation, etc. So God can sense things as such in an absolute way, whereas human and animals can sense images of things in a relative way. They can't sense things as they are. For instance, when I see a chair, I only see a portion of it. I don't see the back side of it. But for God, sees all sides of things. And the sensorium has absolute content of the world, whereas human sensorium has relative content of the world, from your perspective, from your way you are looking at things. And so there is a big difference between absolute quantities and relative quantities. This idea that absolute quantities and relative quantities are very different is very sort of seminal to create mechanics, which is called Newtonian mechanics. Sensorium of creature is caged in the body and not that of God. God doesn't have any body. That's why sensorium of man is relative. God is not the soul of the world. This is, many people in theologies think God is soul of world. In fact, all of you have certain impressions about say things like God, etc. And you could be atheist, agnostic, whatever it is, but you do have some impressions. These are popular impressions which you may be against or for, that God is a kind of soul of the world. He was against this idea. God is not soul of the world. It is the universe. It's an empire of the universe. Empire means it's the government of universe. God is a kind of government of universe, not really somebody who created universe, etc. And so God is not a soul of the world. Neither is world a body of God, nor does God resemble human mind. It's very different from human mind. The term God is principally a name of a power and an empire. This is given the theological traditions. Given these traditions, it's very new. All these ideas are very new, but it's coming out of his conception of the sensorium of God, which is continuum. Continuum is a sensorium. And he makes this radical difference between relative and absolute space, time, etc. and motion. And this distinction brings in what can be called the laws of Newtonian laws. For instance, in the earlier quote, when he talks about idolatry, idolatry is confusing relative with absolute. and he gave lots of instances of idolatry in the time in England and things like that. Or idolatry is Murti Puja, like Indians do. Many of the Sanatan people do Murti Puja, and which is taking idol as the deity. Imagining that idol is a deity, he called idolatry. Idolatry is a practice Christians are against, but it has seeped into Christianity in the church, the idols kept, etc. But he was against idolatry, and idolatry is confusing relative thing for absolute. I mean, your own ego, if you confuse with God's ego, that is idolatry. The small thing should not be confused with a big thing, and idolatry is basically confusion of absolute quantities with relative quantities, which is what physics before him did. Understanding of motion in Galileo and other people, including Descartes, wasn't clear because a distinction between absolute and relative quantities are not made. So imagining oneself as God, or an object as God, or a statue as God, is something, it goes against what is the fabric of the world, universe. So people do this error, they read absolute quantities in scriptures. For instance, Bible said God created world in 6 days, and 7th day he rested, the day of Sabbath, which is why we have Sundays, and Sundays is the day of Sabbath, because God created world in 6 days, the 7th day it rested. Now these 6 days, 7th day, if these numbers are taken as absolute quantities, then you get a totally different idea of universe, that God created universe in 6 days, and universe began maybe sometime in, some people calculated around 4000 BC, etc. At that time, that was a size or a imagination that world was created around 4000 BC by astronomers, and it will end someday. This idea comes, and the time is beginningless according to Newton. It's endless because the sensorium of God. The time being beginningless is something very different from what Christianity was saying at that time, where God created the world sometimes in 6000 years ago. And that figure is not altogether baseless at that time, because given the size of a sun, given size of sun, one could calculate if it is made of coal, then how many years it will burn out, and variation in the size of sun. From those calculations, it was thought that universe is maybe 6000 years old, and that's when God created. So the universe is a beginning. But Newton came up with the idea that no, this is reading some quantities mentioned in scriptures in absolute way. This is idolatry. This is defilement of thought. This is like having a wrong attitude to knowledge. And taking relative quantities as absolute in nature is an error which Galileo, Tycho Brahe, and many other Kepler, etc. did. When they looked at motion, they didn't distinguish between absolute and relative quantities. So he could have a first law of motion, where things will keep moving even if they are not acted on by any force. Earlier idea was things move because there is a force behind it, but he said no, things will keep moving and at a uniform tenor, if not acted till they are acted on by external force. This idea comes up only because there is a strong distinction he makes between a sensorium of God and sensorium of man. This idea that thinking about sciences, say physics, and thinking about affairs of mankind, even theology, etc., are very different is a very new idea. It doesn't have a history of more than 100 years or kind of thing, which we know. We have been hardwired into that, but he was really enlivened by this idea of new idea of God we use there. It goes against lots of traditions, and this creates certain physics there was, and all this is coming because there is the idea of continuum. The continuum, what Renaissance did was to introduce idea of continuum in human affairs. In the reflective space of reason, the continuum is introduced. It's a ground for everything, which is the idea of God. How can man be placed on this continuum? You could place matter on the continuum, which he did in his Principia Mathematica. How matter behaves in the continuum, and using distinction between relative and absolute quantities, he could give laws of motion. Matter could be understood on the continuum, but how do we place man in the continuum, especially the sensorium of man, which is like how do we understand mind using the material of the body. So matter can be, due to its relative spatiotemporal extension, behavior of matter is because matter is sort of extended in space time, and one can look at mathematics of this matter to create laws of motion. But the substance of sensorium is something which is not constructed out of matter. Like in the modern neuroscience, many people believe that it's possible to certain configuration of matter can create this sensorium, but that's open. But he thought that sensorium is something which is drawing from space and time directly, not drawing from matter. It draws from whatever is in the embrace of space and in the sight of vision of time. This substance of sensorium is closely related to absolute space and time. This is fairly fantastic to imagine, but he thought so. And how does it draw from this sensorium from God is also closely related to how does motion from within of matter draws from God. Since everything, all matter and all created things and all creatures are in purview of God in absolute way, God could move them from within. And it's very important for his physics, this idea, moving from within. And he developed his own theology towards this. It's something like a theological revolution of some science. Like you have scientific revolution in the sense understanding of motion is no longer same now. But this theology, if told publicly, would be very threatening. And so to understand how sensoriums of God is active in creating human sensoriums and in creating all motions from within. For instance, why do people move? Why have people, you come and moved from your places to this class? Why have you moved in here? Now this is Newton's problem. How do things move? How do men and animals and matter move? This is his original problem. And why did you come to this class? And what made your body move? This is a motion, according to Newton, it's a motion from within. There are some forces inside you which acted inside you. It could be certain obligatory forces or the promises maybe you have made here and there which have made you move to this class. And this motion into this class is something he wants to explain. The motion of man in the continuum, motion of matter in the continuum is possible by just looking at matter and God. Motion of man in the continuum will be possible by looking at God and man, and along with the sensorium of man, the relative sensorium and the God. He tries to do that. For instance, he puts a problem, it's in old English, a motion of creatures. This is his major problem. He is not addressing motion of matter. All his life, Newton is engaged in understanding motion of human beings, motion of animals, and what really motion is, including motion of matter. How do the motion of body follow from the will, and whence is the instinct in animal? from where why do animal moves? How does the instinct work in them? And why does men move? Why did you will to come into class? This is a major problem of motion. And is not the sensory of animals that place in which sensitive substance is present? The sensitive substance is your sensorium. When a dog moves, the sensorium dog also moves with that dog. And this is a sensitive substance. So he posits a sensitive substance is present and into which the sensible species of things are carried through the nerves and the brain, that they may be perceived by their immediate presence to the substance. This substance, sensory substance, is there everywhere, and these things being rightly dispatched, that is the nervous impulses, etc., does it not appear from phenomenon that there is a being incorporeal, living, intelligent, omnipresent, who is infinite space? Space and time are something which are animate according to him, and though their absolute space is and absolute time, there is no changes in them, but they are animate. As it were, in his sensory, sees the thing themselves intimately and thoroughly perceives them and comprehends them wholly by their immediate presence to himself. Of which things the images only carried through the organs of senses in us into our little sensoriums are there seen and upheld by us. That which in us perceives and thinks, we only apprehend little things, but God apprehends everything. And it is because God sees through everything, fate, it is through the grace of God that we move. We move through the grace of God. That's his idea, and explains why people move. I mean, human affairs, the behavior of people, psychology of people, and politics of people, all the motions is a general problem of motion of human being. There is a continuum which is related to the idea of God, and little bit of it, because of the fall of man, is inherited by this formation called human body or animal body. And in this, what is sensed is only relative things. Since God knows everything, omnipresent and omniscient, can see through everything, it is depending on the grace which you have, depending on the understanding of God which you have, and surrender to God which you give, that God puts in forces that move you to do things which are punishable or do things which are rewardable, etc. It's God who does that. And this is a force from within. In his physics, the idea of force from within was very central and very different from what Tycho Brahe, etc., other people doing mechanics did. God moves upright men in accordance with moral principles, which is there in the book of scriptures, lest they fall back to idolatry. Idolatry is a great sin, according to him. God moves sentient souls from within. God is a cause of good endeavor. It impels instincts in brutes also. It's a God who causes people to chat among themselves in the class. It's God who causes all kind of things, according to Newton. And this various causations, impulsions from God or forces from within depends on your moral uprightness. And one can see through when you meet people how they are moved, how upright they are, etc., etc. And sort of it's talking about human affairs. So realm of creatures is directly subservient to God, whereas in sentient realm of matter, of created matter, also effuses subservience to God in a different way. Such subservience is not only because God is a creator, this is Newtonian theology, not because God has created this matter, that's why matter is under the dominion of God, not because God is a creator, and not only because God is the first cause of motion. Some people, medieval people, thought God created matter and gave a first push, and then there is, according to laws, matter is moving. It's not because God is the first cause of motion, not only because God exercised choice in design of the universe. Some of the sort of biological evolutionists, and they are theologians in biology these days, some 30 years back, who talked about design, because certain changes, biological changes which are very low probability, only they can explain evolution. So they think that God intervened into evolution of things. This is God exercised choice in design of universe and redesign of matter, as orthodoxies believe. None of these things. None of these are the ways by which matter is subservient to God. There is something else. And he says he is working on both the books simultaneously with the same concepts. Writing two books at the same time is a big thing. But most of good people have done that. So if you look at how does matter move, there is moving from within. Matter moves from within. There is a center of matter where forces occur, and matter moves in compliance with the continuum, which is in compliance with God. That is one kind of thing. Motion of matter involves spatial and temporal contiguity of causes and effect, and there is laws of motions are there. But basically subservience of matter to God's dominion comes from a concept, very revolutionary concept he came up with, which is action at a distance. Because all material changes should have cause effect, and they should be contiguous. If something comes and hits here, this moves, other thing moves because of causal contiguity. But a moon and the water body in earth, the tide, can act at distance. This idea that you can have cause and effect where contiguity, spatial contiguity and temporal contiguity is not required, is a revolutionary idea in Newtonian physics. It really changed all physics from past. It's also counterintuitive. It's entirely counterintuitive. How can thing here affect something there? If there is no spatial contiguity and temporal contiguity, how something from past can affect something today? Our popular idea of causation is that cause and effect must be in space and time contiguous. You can't have a cause which was yesterday and having effect today, or you can't have a cause which is here and the effect is happening there instantaneously. There must be a chain which is spatially and temporally contiguous. This was the idea. But Newton brought in a grace of God. Grace of God is because everything, all matter is in the embrace of God. A moon and the ocean are also in the embrace of God, and God can make them move together instantaneously. This motion from within is a fundamental idea of Newton. And this changed, this really brought Newton physics and explained gravity. He gave that inverse square law of gravity out of this. So causal action across spatial gap, he accepted. It's totally counterintuitive. It's very difficult, nobody could believe it easily. It took around 2 centuries to believe it after Newton, 1.5 century or so, till rational mechanics is born. Even there, what is a force is still a open issue. What really is a force? How are things impelled to move? And there are 4 kinds of forces people say today: nuclear forces and weak interaction forces, strong interaction forces, etc. And or gravitational forces. The unification of forces is an issue. Force is a open issue today. What really is a force? It's not something which is settled. And some of you, if you can go into that kind of reflectivity which is going on in physics, it would be a great life spent. And but that apart, Force is that where there is a action at a distance. That is force. Some force, which is called an inertial force, can be handled by Newton's first law, second law, third law. The gravitational force is handled by the inverse square law. And the relation between gravitation and inertial force we will tackle somewhere later. It's a very interesting thing. At the foundation of contemporary physics, it's an important issue. And Newton has a vision, an imagination of the universe. And this imagination doesn't differentiate between humanities and science. It's a unified imagination, and whatever he is doing, he is reforming the world. He is reforming the world. He is telling the world how to read book of scriptures and how to read book of nature. He is writing these two books simultaneously. And this idea that synchronic action across time, across gravity, is something only Newtonian, and it created something like how to calculate projectile of some body you throw, some rigid body when you throw, how to create projectile of that. This calculation was possible, and that was a great Newtonian fiat, celebrated till today in our school books and in our learnings. This idea of force is something which is what I want you people to pay attention to. So, what would be the forces which are, say, moving some people to talk in the class or to chat in the class? What are the forces? So, can you explain the forces which are there? Yeah. Forces which are there for you to talk in the class. What kind of forces are operative? You're waiting. What were the forces which are operative while you chat in the class? Huh? Force of interest or non-interest, force of non-interest. Or the chatting content is interesting. You have to ask this question to enter into humanities. You really have to ask questions of what are the forces which govern us. That's where you start entering into humanities. So, interest of what kind? I didn't understand. You can also help here. Yeah? You can also help. What are the forces which make you chat in the class? It's plain English, Baba. What would be the forces? Anyway, two of you really have to write an essay on that. On this affair, what were the forces which make you to chat in the class? They are well known. I mean, they are not very mysterious. It could be something, some assignment to be done. It could be something, movie you have seen. It could be anything. It's not a matter of shame. I mean, I'm not punishing you in that sense. But it's good to raise the issue, what are the forces which impel us? This is a foundation question in humanities. What are the forces which impel us? Why do people do artwork? Why do people come to class? Why do people, what is the obligation? Why do people do education? Why do people feed each other? Why do people help each other? What really is? Why do people have such and such feeling, not others? Why does person in psychology feel the way? Why does person buy something and sell something? Why does person produce something? What for? These are forces which work in economy, they work in society, they work in, one has to ask this question, what these forces are. And that's where humanities began. Newton has introduced one idea of synchronic action of God. God can put things, is an embrace of everything, is touching everything, and can put things in each other's dependence, and it's done by inverse square law. And he came up with such a clarity Newton had that inverse square law really explained Kepler's laws completely, or astronomy, etc. It also explained behavior of objects when you throw them up, what happens to them, and it brought mechanics to technology. One could do things with mechanics because there was theory of gravity. It's in theory of gravity that mechanics, the three laws can be put into action, and design, one could design even calibrate the angle of a cannon using it, and which was done. And this action at a distance is not a small thing, because nobody is something which goes against understanding of causation. It really goes against understanding what causality is. It's very revolutionary, and this created way for what can be called as scientific revolution. A confidence that science can come up with things which are hidden. It can come up with hidden truths. Came out of this. That's why Alexander Pope said, when God said that Newton be and all was light, is because of that. And we also individually are indebted to Newton for various things. Now that was motion from within of matter, of a created things. What is motion from within of the creatures? Which is, how is the compliance to God done? Motion of creatures involves instantaneous grace of God. He came up with the concept of grace. Grace is a big force. It's like a gravity. Gravity is a force. He wanted to come up with the laws of grace. It's the grace of God which is the basic force which moves people, which decides interests of people. And all this thing is a grace of God. And there must be some scriptural laws of motion. All his studies of scriptures, he was a very learned person in scriptures. In fact, he wrote that one thing he never tires reading is scriptures. And if at all Newton read anything, it was scriptures largely. And much of his history, etc., is scriptural history. So there has to be scriptural laws of motion and synchronic action of God. The causation in human behavior, what causes human behavior is action at a distance. We are different people. If you take any two people, their sensoriums are utterly different. They are so two different sensorias at two different locations, having two different bodies. How do they act on each other? How do we force others to say attend class, and without interest also make people attend class? How is it done? How are these forces operative? And to understand all this, one has to understand what norms are, what really is obligation, what is that people feel obliged to work, what is injunction. Injunction is commandment, and what is prohibition, and what is allowed, what behavior is allowed, what is prohibited. All these things one has to understand, which is basically they form scriptural laws of motion. So scriptural laws of motions are really humanities, according to Newton. It's a grand imagination, and it will be really, you will be a richer person if you can get this imagination of Newton. And it's only in 1.5 hours I am trying to convey this imagination to you people. And if you get it, you will be a richer person and a more enlightened person. to understand structures of grace. Humanities, according to Newton, is basically structure of grace. So, which decides, which understanding structure of grace, which is in scriptures, which could be said 10 commandments of Moses, love thy neighbor, etc., or it could be whatever else. These are the laws by which, if you read scriptures, why should one read Bible? Is to understand human behavior. But he says, don't read Bible in a way that you take some relative quantities as absolute. Don't attribute to God which is not attributable to God. God is just a sensorium of absolute space and absolute time, nothing else. So don't attribute something like that. For example, one of the inference Newton makes, it's a out of his rationality of his imagination, grand imagination, he makes a deduction, which is like every person has some suffering or other. You feel bad, you suffer, etc. Some people undergo massive suffering. We may be knowing such people, each of us individually, people who have suffered a lot in their life, and so this suffering is because of certain situation of the grace of God that a person is suffered. Can there be what God did once was introduced an entity a creature in the universe. This creature has a special property that it could suck up suffering of others. If there was suffering happening in the world, and if you find somebody walking into IIIT who can suck up your suffering and you will all be happy, Jivan Vidya would be all great here. And so somebody who just takes away those suffering from you, if there is such a creature, God actually created such a man, and this man was called Christ. Christ it's like Mother Teresa, who picks up destitutes from the streets because she is moved by this idea in the service of God, and sort of feeds a person. Even if one has to go hungry, you feed other. Like mother says, "Meri umr tumhe lag jaye" type thing, is also that if somebody is suffering, there is a urge that of communion with other person, so that your suffering is lessened. Other person sucks up your suffering. A supreme such person is Christ, Son of God. He could deduce all these things, entire rationality in the scriptures. He could understand what is fall of man totally differently. He could understand what Christ is totally differently from the current times. And this was all this idea of Newton. It's like because certain censorship was not ratified, and they were not taught to you in school. In school only few things are taught. That is, pedagogic biases exist. What is to be taught in school is a political issue also. What is to be taught in school? This portion of Newton was not taught in school or in your college curriculum. And but this censorship existed till around 1980s, when some people took interest, and most of these works are there on net. You can look at. It's called New Newton Scholarship, newnewton.com or something like that. I have mentioned somewhere in the slide. So one has to look up these things, and what kind of things he was engaged in. He was really reforming or giving a new light. Renaissance means new light, or in Latin is bringing in a new vision into old things. And he is able to do on the book of scriptures and book of nature. In fact, the confidence that what he is doing is right is coming out of his theology. That theology is what gives him this confidence, and it is work in theology which creates. Yeah, sometimes it bugs me when you talk. Sometimes it doesn't, but sometimes it does. So if you, people who talk, if you sort of voluntarily take up an assignment to really write on what really forces which are involved here, it would really give more insights into what is happening in IIIT, in your situation of your life, situation of your teachers, etc. It will bring more light to that. This is the human inquisitiveness. If you can, people who write, who are talking, voluntarily take up this analysis, this class is a success. You keep talking, doesn't matter. It matters only if I am sort of disturbed. Otherwise, it doesn't. So, if you take this as an assignment voluntarily, whoever has talked, if you can take up this assignment to really analyze the forces which are operative while talking, or the forces which are operative while I am speaking also. It's not that you have to criticize yourself or something. You can criticize the situation of IIIT, introducing course like Humanities into engineering curriculum, all kind of things. Just analyze this, it will be a great service and the class will be success. Other thing he said was that what is prayer? Prayer is not something like going to church. Prayer is what he called experiment. Experiment is a form of prayer. He did lots of experiment in optics, in this, that, in human experiments. He was a successful political man. He was a finance minister of England, etc. To discover handiwork of God, one has to do experiment. Experiment is a kind of prayer. And experimental sciences are taught to you because you can pray. And in created as well, experiment in created realm like in matter as well as in creature realm. People do keep experimenting, say things to each other, etc. and look for responses and such things. And to discover laws of nature and laws of scripture, only method is experimentation. And experiment is like doing a prayer. What you do a prayer, say before food or some other time, etc., in church or in mandir, etc. He thought that experiment is a new prayer, fairly revolutionary, and suppose somebody knows it. If you were actually physically students of Newton, you would be sort of overwhelmed by the type of things he's doing, and his theology was completely heretical. I mean, it was not Catholic, it was not Protestant, it was not Lutheran, etc. And he thought that the first religion was the most rational of all other till the nations corrupted it. For there is no way without revelation to come to the knowledge of deity but by the frame of nature. Is from the frame of nature you can know what the God is. And there was a person called Nicodemus. Newton thought that he has a lineage to this person called Nicodemus, who came by night to Jesus. And there is stories about him, the Jew, king of Jews. And Newton actually looked at his genealogy of his thought to trace back to Nicodemus. And there is a secret society going from that time to him. And if natural philosophy in all its paths, by pursuing this method shall at length be perfected, the bounds of moral philosophy will also be enlarged. He thought the doctrine of Trinity, the Mother, Child and the Holy Ghost is idolatry. So wherever Medusa, Madonna, etc. are there in churches is all idolatry. Immortality of soul is idolatry. Soul is not immortal, like much of the Indian tradition believes. Soul is immortal. Buddhists don't believe. He thought immortality of soul is a wrong doctrine. Soul is basically a relative sensorium. You may die. Transmigration of soul and reincarnation is all false. These are coming out of his system. Beings like Satan, devil and evil spirits and even lots of gods, plural gods, is basically distemper of mind and not true beings. Quantities in scriptures are not absolute. revealed morals are absolute, esoteric quantities of matter are false. All these philologistic qualities in motions like descent of Christ, Satan falling, which are there in scriptures, are not true motions. It never happened. One can't understand what does it mean, descent of Christ or fall of Satan. Experiment is a new form of worship of divine, and he upheld divine causation. God is intervening all the time. In gravity it's intervening, in human affairs it's intervening. So it's a grand vision of theology he had, which out of which came his physics. He accepts something like trans-spatial causation, causation across space, spatial gaps, instantaneous action at distance. But Newton doesn't accept anything like jump across time. The cause cannot jump across time to create an effect. Newton takes that cause can jump across distance, space to create an effect, but can't jump across time. Because if you allow cause to jump across time to create an effect, if you allow that, you may not need God. That's a different thing. No jump across time, he doesn't allow. So we can ask a question, do creatures jump across time? Do creatures like animals and men, do they jump across time? Most people will say they can't, because the way most people said that no forces can't jump across space instantaneously. The forces can't jump across space instantaneously. A forces across time cannot jump across time. Some force which has origin 300 years ago cannot act today. But humanities is largely about forces which jump across time. They jump across space, they jump across time. Continuum is not a good idea in humanities, because humanities deals with forces which jump across space and jump across time. For instance, your memory. Memory is a force. It's something which has happened some time back, but memory can cause recollective action, recollective cognition today. That okay, I was there. Sometime earlier you were there and now you can say I was there. Is because this something, your presence yesterday can cause cognition today that you were there, recollective cognition. Is that force of your presence yesterday is acting today. It's a jump across time. Memory can't be understood, human memory, if one can't see jump across time. And it so happens computational memories don't jump across time. They are contiguous. Human memory do. What really is a purposive action? It's like jumping into future. I want to sort of get good job, I want to do this, I want to do that, finish assignment or do something, whatever you want. It's like you're jumping across into future and trying to do it in present. It's the forces of future operating on you. So prospecting future or indulging in past is what we do all the time. There are cultural forces, there are forces of impressions, there are forces of memory, there are forces of dispositions, of personalities, etc. How do these forces display trans-temporal causation? It's a very exact question. Can there be a theory of trans-temporal forces? It's an exact question, you can get this question, and humanities is about answering this question. All disciplines of humanities, be it arts, be it economics, be it whatever, political science, is about answering the question, trying to make a theory of forces which jump across time. You have sort of done something in past that is having effect today. What are those things? And how do these forces operate? This is what humanities is all about. So, if defining mark of the motion of creatures is seen as jumping across time, such forces, jumping across time forces, would the concept of Newtonian God be necessary, redundant rather? Which is, here's a question I'm asking, is a tough question. Suppose we accept jump across time. Newton only accepted instantaneous jump across space. Suppose you accept jump across time, then will Newtonian God be necessary at all? We can still think of sensorium as something to do with space-time, but need not think of absolute God as that, because then people are not moved just by grace of God, they are moved by historical forces, they are moved by cultural forces, they are moved by political forces, they are moved by psychological forces. People are moved by all kind of forces, and all these forces jump across time. So, if I'm successful in creating what Newton is saying, this is the kind of Newton you never knew. This Newton was really on the dark side of you and ignorance. These forces are forces of memory, and in fact they have been conceived in the all kind of traditions, not much in Christian tradition, because grace of God, you have Indian civilization which doesn't work with the grace of God, most of it, and including Islam doesn't work with the grace of God, it works with some other principles. So if you analyze Islam and see how Islam accepts jump across time, and it's a deedic, it accepts something called deed. You do something, you reap fruit somewhere later, that kind of thing. And some concepts like karma, these are popularly heard concepts. A karma of a person, whatever you do, you reap that. In fact, if you do bad things, you will suffer. Even if there is no entity which can suck up your suffering. There is no such entity which can suck up your suffering. Whatever you do, you will have to reap its fruits. This idea, so traditionally, the force of karma is accepted as determining our human behavior, or also term used for this is adrasht, which is unseen forces, the forces which are hidden. The hidden forces are operative in us, and apurv is also force which is unprecedented, which has no past. Even such forces exist. There are terms for this which are trans-temporal causality. In the Indian tradition, trans-temporal causality is very accepted. It is not accepted, it's accepted in finite time in Christianity. It is not accepted by Newton, and it's with difficulty that modernity accepts that. For instance, there are forces, cultural forces, which are operating in creating people today in India, but there are forces like say modernity, and there are forces, magnetic forces, where you have moved out of your home and you are all trying to establish your home. You have a temporary home in hostel, you will have a better home where you do job, and maybe you will have a yacht of your own, etc. in future. Whatever it is, these magnetic forces which are there, one has to see one's situation, and one does it all the time by reflecting on all these forces. Humanities is about reflection on all these forces, trans-temporal forces. And so there is an assignment I am giving you now, which some of you can add extra bit to it. You really have to work out and you are under equipped to work out, you generally just have to reflect to work out. In a sense, you have not faced this question earlier. What really moves this man? Or what, as I said, what really moves some people who are talking among themselves is irrelevance of the way I teach Newton, not irrelevance of Newton, irrelevance of the teacher in teaching Newton. What really moves this man? This is an unfamiliar question, but try to answer it. Try to answer this, or not just this man, you can take any other thing. This is, you have to write an essay, small essay, on jump across time. You have to conceive, these are concepts, conceptually you have to think of what really jump across time is in various domains, and because these are forces which determine us. Do we require Newtonian God if jump across time is accepted? If some of you can answer this, very good. This is a tough question because this involves a lot of rational finesse of mind to be able to handle this. Mind should be conceptually sophisticated to handle this question, but you can try this. And in what way humanities accepts jump across time? Say your familiarity with psychology, economics, etc., or your familiarity with situations you have analyzed closely, including political situations, like anything, what's happening in contemporary time also, up, party, or whatever it is. You can pick them up and human situation, analyze forces, and show why these forces have a nature that there is a causal jump across time. You have to show this, you have to see this. To be able to have this insight, you have done this assignment, and also some of you can analyze also why people have to talk in this class apart from the instructor, and the forces which are operative in that. So this is a thing which you submit on the Republic Day, and there is some kind of freedom which can't talked about. The freedom is dare to be wise. It's very difficult to have courage to dip into wisdom. The stubbornness and the inertia of stubbornness and the gravity of courage are two different things. Like Newton is talking of the inertia which is there, inertial motion, and gravitational motion is done by from within. The dare to be wise, this courage is very difficult, and you get studenthood only if you get this courage. And just because some topic is unfamiliar to you, uninteresting to you, is lack of courage rather than wisdom at all. It's inertia. It's inertial. To live in a comfort zone is inertia. And I mean, a lot of people have this inertia, and they have self-justification for the inertia of that kind. But to be able to answer this, I think, is one action. Earlier assignments were very sort of shaken kind of assignments. From now, we have assignments which are where certain engagement of wisdom is required. And this is the first assignment where we want you to engage with your wisdom. And as Kant said, dare to be wise and do this. It's a difficult thing. It's something you have not thought, but do it. Okay.